what's going on? Welcome back to the channel. Apologies you've not seen me in a while, but we're slowly getting back into it. We've still got all the cars, so we've still got the Supra, still got the Mk4, the Civic and the GT86. In this video we're working on the Supra. So the idea in this video, we're going to fit a GE VVTI oil pump, and whilst we're there, get the sump taken to the fabricators, ready for the turbo drain to go into it. Like I say, we're on the way to the unit now because the car's already there, so I'll see you at the unit. So now that we're at the unit underneath the vehicle, the first thing that we've got to take off underneath is the exhaust. Once the exhaust's out of the way, we can then move on to taking the bracing off and the heat shield in, and once all that's out of the way, it's then time to take the prop shaft out. Let's get into it. So this is where we're currently at. So the exhaust is off, the prop's off. So now we've just got to go inside the car and take off all the shifter up the top there, and then drain the gearbox fluid, undo the bell housing bolts, undo this bracket, and then the gearbox will be out. Now that we've finished up inside the vehicle taking the shifter out, it's now time to go back under the car, drain all the fluid, and then we can move on to taking off the slave cylinder, undoing all the pressure plate bolts, and finally undoing all the bell housing bolts. So because this car's got an R154 in it rather than the factory W58, the clutch setup is slightly different. I believe V16 is set up like this as well. But basically you have to undo all the pressure plate bolts before you can take the gearbox out of the car. So as you can see now, we've got the ratchet through the slave cylinder hole, we're just spinning the crank round and then undoing them all. Once that's done, we can then remove the gearbox. Okay, so this is the current state of the car now. We've got the gearbox out, so we've got all this free space. Makes it a lot easier to take the engine out. So now we've got to move on to taking the engine out. First thing we're going to do is right here, we're just going to drain the radiator. So whilst the car was in the air just draining the radiator, I got some ladders and undid the fuel feed from the fuel tank in the boot of the car. The reason that you have to do this is because if I just undid it from underneath the car first, then it would just gravity empty the whole tank, which we don't really want, to be honest. Whereas undoing it from the fuel tank first, it means that when we're undoing it from the filter, only a little bit comes out, as you've just seen. And now we're just undoing the final bolts under the car, which is for the power steering into the sump. Once that's done, we can lower the car to the floor and work on the engine from the engine bay. And first up is disconnecting everything to get the radiator out. So now you can see the radiator's out of the car. We've just got to take the auxiliary belt off. We're going to remove the power steering and the aircon from the engine, leave them in the car when we pull the engine out. So like I just said, we're just going to pop the auxiliary belt off, and then once that's off, we can now move on to taking the intake off the car. So this is just 2 bolts and a little vacuum line which goes into the side of the intake, and then once that's off, we move on to the coolant hoses which are at the back of the engine that go into the heater matrix. As you can see, these were a bit fiddly to get off, to be fair, but we got there in the end. Once they're off, we can then start undoing all the distributor stuff. So these bolt straight into the wing. I just undo all the bolts and then rest it on top of the engine instead of having to unplug everything. Once that's out of the way, we can then move on to disconnecting the wire to the alternator. Once this bolt's out, we then need to just undo this clip so that the wire is free from it. And now there's just 2 plugs on the steering rack, and then there's just the throttle cable to undo. And once that's done, that's the driver's side completely free. It's time to move on to the passenger passenger side. Once we're on the passenger side, as you can see, the first thing we're taking off is the power steering pump, and we're also doing the aircon pump, which is beneath it. There's 6 bolts in total, but for the aircon pump there is actually a stud which goes into the block, which you should be able to take out so you can remove it whilst the engine's in the car, but I actually snapped this, so I had to wait till the engine was above the chassis rail to be able to physically take the aircon pump off the engine. So for now we've unbolted everything and pushed the power steering pump out the way, and now we're just moving on to the carbon canister at the back of the engine so that we have access to the wiring harness. Once that's out the way, we can undo this boot out of the firewall, and then we can go inside the car and unplug it from the ECU. But before we do that, whilst we're outside the car, we're just going to take the bonnet off. Now that we're in the footwell of the car, there's 4 plugs that we have to undo in here. So there's 2 that go into the body, the 2 on the left hand side that we're undoing now, and then the other 2 on the right hand side which plug into the ECU. So one of them screwed in and the other one is just plugged in. Once all 4 of them are out, it's then time to pull the whole loom through the firewall and out into the engine bay. I'd recommend 2 of you doing this just to avoid you ripping any wires or anything, if one person's in the bottom, just to try and help ease it out. Once it's out, we just rest it on top of the engine ready to come out. Now it's just time to undo the final bits on the passenger side of the car. So currently we're undoing the map sensor, and then we move on to taking the earthing kit off, which obviously isn't a factory thing, this has been added on aftermarket. I can only presume this was put on the car in Japan before it got shipped over to the UK. When it comes to me actually turboing this car, this won't be staying on it. So once all the earthing kit's off, I just unplugged these 2 vacuum lines for the power steering, and then once them 2 are off, it's now time to undo the final earth for the engine to the body. Once this is off, it's time to just undo the igniter. So again, I just unbolt this and put it on top of the engine. I could have unplugged it, but I just thought it was easy to unplug the whole lot. Next up is unplugging these 2 plugs which go into the bottom of the fuse box, and once them plugs have been undone, it's then a case of just following the wires back and unplugging any of the clips which are holding them to the chassis rail, just so that they're completely free when it comes to actually pulling the engine out of the car. The main battery I have for this does sit underneath an aircon pipe, so if you don't do this, there is a chance you could damage that aircon pipe when you go to pull the engine out. And again, once all that was free, we just rested it on top of the engine. And the last thing to do, ready to take the engine out, is just undo the fuel return. Once that fuel returns off, the engine is now 100% free to come out of this car. So everything is disconnected. To be honest, it wasn't actually that bad of a job, to be fair, to disconnect everything. However, I did try this job at home before coming to this unit, so I did already have some experience in doing it, to be fair. But I think to get to this stage, so the gearbox out, the engine stripped down, etc., I think we were only in it for like 2 or 3 hours, to be honest, so it's not bad at all in my opinion. But like I said earlier, I had already tried this before, so I wasn't going in it blind, so to speak. But now that's the engine 100% disconnected, it's now time to get it out. So because of how long the front end is on a Supra, we had to take the front bumper off just so the crane could get as close to the car as possible. I could have took the crash bar off as well, but I decided not to. I put the beam out to the 500 kilo setting, which is the shortest that I could have the beam with the crane being able to reach the engine. As you'll see when we start putting pressure on the crane, we did have to stand on it because a 2JZ is not light, and with having the beam out at the 500 kilo setting, the crane wasn't 100% sturdy, but overall I thought it was safe enough to do it and it was completely fine. And just like that, the engine's out. So that leaves us with the massive engine bay completely empty. Now would have been a good time to probably paint this engine bay and just clean it up a little bit, but I was borrowing the unit off a friend and I just didn't want to take the mick with it, to be honest. I just wanted to get the work done and get the car out of the unit as fast as possible so he could have it back. So unfortunately I didn't clean the engine bay up, but let's get into working on the engine. So the first thing I started doing on the engine was undoing all the sump bolts. So I undid all the bolts that were on the outside, so all the upper sump bolts first and then all the lower sump bolts after. You have to actually take the lower sump off before you can remove the upper sump because there's quite a few bolts inside the lower sump that hold the upper sump on, if that makes sense. Once you've done all of that, it's then time for me to move on to taking the crank pulley off. I did actually loosen this bolt off whilst the engine was in the car, so once the engine was out it was pretty straightforward to just undo it. And then I just used the pulley removal tool to actually get the pulley off. And then once that's off, I'm just undoing all the plastic covers so I have access to the timing kit. And as you can see, there is loads of these little 5mm bolts holding these 3 plastic covers on. Once majority of them little 5mm bolts are out, I can then take the top 2 covers off. Once they're out of the way, I can take the idler tensioner off for the auxiliary belt, and then once that's off, I have to take the pulley off of the water pump because there is a bolt for the bottom cover that's hidden behind that pulley. And once that final bolt's out, I can now remove that bottom cover, and then we have access to the full timing belt. However, we're going to carry on getting the sump off so I can take it to the fabricators and get the turbo drain welded in. So as you've just seen, I've just got the lower sump off, so now I can get inside the upper sump, undo all the bolts, and then remove the upper sump. As you can see, the engine's resting on the axle stands. I have got the engine crane still attached to it at the top. The axle stands are just on the engine mounts just to take majority of the weight, whilst the crane's just up there to stop the engine rocking forwards and backwards pretty much. The reason I did it this way is because I simply just didn't want to take the flywheel off. I've not long put this flywheel on with ALP bolts and everything, but I just didn't want to take it off, so I opted for this way. But now all of the bolts are undone, it's time to get the upper sump off. Okay, so that's the sump off. I've given it a clean and everything, and now it's ready to take to the fabricator. So I've bought this little bung, as you can see, and this is going to get welded into this little hole here. So all rear sump 2JZs will have this marking here. Obviously on the turbo models it's already cut out for the factory turbo drain, whereas on the NAs it's just imprinted ready to be cut out. But basically the fabricator is going to weld this bung into the factory hole. So whilst the sump is with the fabricator, I've gone back to the unit and carried on working on the engine. So at the moment, as you can see, we're just undoing the timing belt tensioner. I'm undoing it evenly so that it doesn't come off at an angle or anything like that, and once this is off we can then move on to just taking the whole timing belt off. It's worth noting that before I actually removed the belt, I did make sure that all the timing marks were correct. Once all of this was off, it's then time to remove the bottom pulley. I used a pry bar for this because I didn't have the correct equipment. I don't recommend this because it did damage the pulley, but luckily I wasn't using this pulley again anyway. The reason I'm fitting a GE VVTI oil pump is so that I can run a crank trigger, so that does mean that we have to fit a new pulley, so essentially it didn't really matter that we did damage that one. I decided to go for a 36-2 because it's a bit more precise than the 12-tooth ones. But once all that's off, it's then time to start removing the oil pump. We're just going round and doing all the bolts. So I went round and cracked all the bolts off first, so to speak, and then I went round again and actually removed all the bolts. And then once all the bolts are out, it's time to remove the oil pump. So that just pulls off pretty straightforward, to be honest. And once you've got that off, it's now a long time spent cleaning it. And this is one of them things that can't be rushed, to be honest. The more time you spend on it, the better results you're going to have. So as you can see, I'm just going around removing all the old sealer, making sure there's nothing left. And whilst I'm here, I'm also doing underneath, ready for the sump to go back on as well. And I don't know why, but there's also something quite satisfying about doing this job, to be honest. So that's now the front of the block all cleaned. So all we've got to do is install these two O-rings, and then we can put the new oil pump on. So I've actually chosen to put a GE VVTI oil pump on this because it has the crank trigger. A lot of people recommend GTE, but if you go online there's mixed reviews on both, to be honest. But getting into actually fitting the pump, so we do have to put this sealer on it. So this is just gasket sealer. You run it on the inside edge of all the bolt holes, so to speak, but making sure that you're not putting too much on it. I just went online and watched Real Street's video and pretty much copied them, to be honest. It's also worth noting that you shouldn't put these on dry, so what I did was put oil into the actual inlet of the oil pump, and then I used my fingers just to spin the gear around a little bit, just so that there was oil all in the gears, so I wasn't starting the engine up dry. Another thing to note, when you buy the oil pumps, they don't come with a front main seal fitted, so you do have to fit that yourself. I just use a socket to press it in, but just making sure that it only goes flush and no further. If you do push it in further than that, then there is a chance it can block the pressure release valve, which again you don't want. So once the oil pumps are bolted to the engine, it's then time to start putting sealer on the upper sump, ready to bolt that on. As you can see, we're going on the inside of all the bolt holes, exactly the same as the oil pump, apart from the oil pickup, which we've just gone round on the outside. There is also an O-ring for the oil pickup which goes on the block, very similar to how the oil pump is set up. I did change this off camera, so unfortunately I didn't get it on video. And as you can see, that turbo drain bung is now welded into the sump. But going back to actually putting the sealer on the sump, it's just a nice thin line, making sure that I'm not putting too much on it. basically if you do put too much on, when we put the sump up against the engine, it will squish and it can go inside, and if it goes inside, it's a very high chance it'll block the oil pickup, and then we'll have no oil in the engine, so it will destroy the engine pretty much. So it's quite important not to put too much on that, to be honest. Once we're happy with all the sealer on the upper sump, it's time to fit it to the engine and get it bolted up. And then once all the upper sump's bolted to the engine, it's then time to put all the oil pickup in. And once you're happy with all of that, it's time to do exactly the same on the lower sump. So put all the sealer on it, make sure we're not putting too much on it, and then attaching it to the upper sump. But unfortunately I didn't get that on camera either. So now that the sump's all bolted back together, it's time to just put the crank socket back on. So like I said earlier, we've gone for a 36-2 so that we can read a crank trigger from it. This is the factory sprocket which comes on a VVTI. The non-VVTIs normally come with a 12 tooth, but the 36-2 is just a bit more precise, hence we went with that. And as you can see, we're currently just using the factory crank bolt just to help push it on. To be honest, at this point, we're now about 3 days into this, and I didn't really get much more video content after this because 90% of it's on now. It's just a case of putting the timing belt and everything on, which we did off camera. Like I said earlier, we were borrowing a mate's unit and I just didn't want to take the mick with it, and it was starting to get a bit late and we just wanted to get this engine in, the gearbox in and everything before the end of play. So I didn't really get much more content, like I say. So I've just got these bulky clips of actually getting the engine into place and getting the gearbox into place, and then I'll see you back home once the job's finished. Okay, so we're back home with the car now. The only issue that I've found really is the timing belt sits a lot further back than it did before. So if you see here on the teeth, there's a clean mark in there from where the previous timing belt sat. And my belt is quite a bit further back, like you can't really get your fingers down the back of it or anything. I'm not sure if it's overhanging the pulleys or if it's just sat on the back of the pulley. But I have spoke to a Supra specialist, which we have quite local to us. And basically he's advised me that when we put the tensioner on for the timing belt, there should be a little space that goes behind that, and he thinks that I've not put that on and that's why it's done that. But I've driven this car for a good few days now, and so far it doesn't look like the back of the timing belt's catching on anything, so it is okay. Obviously it's just not perfect, like perfectly it would be sat in the middle of the pulley rather than all the way at the back. But as you probably know from if you've watched any of my previous videos, the plan is to put a VVTI head on this, hence I've only put a Gates timing belt on it rather than the proper HKS one that we've bought for it as well. But basically all of this timing kit, so to speak, is going to be redone in the future, so for now it's not the end of the world. It will be completely fine in my opinion. I've also checked the engine over for any other faults like the sump leaking or anything, but it seems completely fine. So touch wood, this engine is now ready for us to start bolting the turbo kit to it, but that is for another video. So that does bring us to the end of this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Like I say, apologies that I've not uploaded in 6 months, or nearly 6 months, but we have been busy, which you'll see on a future video, because we have got a lot of parts for this car now. We've still got the other 3 cars, so we'll start videos coming out on them as well, but I'll see you on the next video.
Even when you feel low, you can still go. Even when you feel slow, you can still go.